Story time, folks. Let me tell you a tale that changed my life forever. It all began in the 1940s, when the world was torn apart by war. I'm Faber, an engineer with a passion for science and a love for my wife, Hannah. I remember the day I had to leave her as if it were yesterday. The smell of her perfume lingered on my coat as I held her tight, trying to memorize every detail of her face. "I'll come back," I promised, my voice barely a whisper. But deep down, I knew the war might keep us apart for longer than we could imagine. With a heavy heart, I boarded the train to Paris. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks matched the beating of my broken heart. As the French countryside whizzed by, I buried myself in my notebook, sketching designs for new machines. Science, after all, was something I could always rely on, logical, predictable, unlike the chaos of war. Paris welcomed me with open arms, but it couldn't fill the void Hannah left. I threw myself into my work, spending long nights in the lab and early mornings at construction sites. My colleagues praised my brilliance, but they didn't see the loneliness that ate away at me. Years passed like pages in a book, each one a reminder of what I'd left behind. I built a reputation, earned accolades, but my greatest achievement, my marriage, was left to gather dust like an old bedtime story forgotten on a shelf. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning in 1960, everything changed. A letter arrived, its edges worn from its long journey. As I opened it with trembling hands, my world tilted on its axis. The words blurred before my eyes, but one sentence stood out clear as day. "You have a daughter." A daughter? My mind reeled. How could this be? Hannah and I had never, but then I remembered our last night together, filled with passion and desperation. Could it be true? Shock gave way to an overwhelming curiosity. I had to know more. I had to see her. 20 years of scientific certainty crumbled in the face of this new, beautiful uncertainty. That night, as I packed my bags, I felt a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. It was time to go home, to face the past I'd left behind, and to meet the daughter I never knew I had. As I drifted off to sleep, my usual dreams of equations and blueprints were replaced by visions of a young woman with Hannah's eyes and my smile. Tomorrow, I would begin the journey to find her, to complete the family I had unknowingly left behind. Little did I know, this bedtime story was about to become the greatest adventure of my life. As I settled into my seat on the plane, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Would my daughter recognize me? Would she even want to meet me? The story of our reunion played out in my head like a bedtime story I'd tell myself over and over. "First time flying?" A friendly voice interrupted my reverie. I turned to see a man with kind eyes and a warm smile. "No, but it feels like it," I replied, my voice betraying my nerves. "I'm Faber." "Herbert," he said, extending his hand. "You look like you could use a friendly ear." Something about Herbert's demeanor put me at ease, and before I knew it, I was pouring out my story. As I mentioned Hannah's name, Herbert's eyes widened. "Hannah?" he repeated. "You wouldn't happen to mean Hannah from Munich, would you?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yes, that's her. How do you know her?" Herbert's next words hit me like a thunderbolt. "She's my sister-in-law. My brother Joki married her about 18 years ago." The world seemed to spin around me. Hannah? Married? To someone named Joki? I felt a pang of jealousy, quickly followed by shame. After all, I was the one who had left. Before I could process this information, a violent jolt shook the plane. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and panic erupted around us. The last thing I remember was Herbert's hand gripping my arm as we plummeted towards the earth. I awoke to the scorching heat of the sun on my face. We had crashed in a vast desert, the plane's wreckage scattered around us like broken toys. Herbert and I were among the few survivors. As we huddled in the shade of a wing, rationing our meager supplies, Herbert and I talked. He told me more about Hannah, and each word was both a blessing and a curse. "She had a child, you know," Herbert said softly one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon. "A girl. She never said who the father was, but now I think I understand." My daughter. The child I had never known. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Hannah moved back to Germany with the child," Herbert continued. "She wanted to be closer to family." As we sat there, stranded in the middle of nowhere, I felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the dire circumstances, I now had a direction, a purpose. I would survive this ordeal, find my way to Germany, and reunite with Hannah and our daughter. The desert nights were cold, and as Herbert and I huddled for warmth, we shared stories. I told him about my life in Paris, my work, my loneliness. He spoke of his family, of Joki and Hannah and the niece he adored. "She's a bright girl," he said, his voice full of pride. "Reminds me of you, actually. Always tinkering with things, asking questions." Each word painted a clearer picture of the daughter I longed to meet. As we waited for rescue, I held on to these stories like precious gems, each one a promise of the future I hoped to have. Little did I know, fate had more surprises in store for me. This was just the beginning of my story, a tale that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, family, and even myself. After days that felt like an eternity, rescue finally came. As the helicopter lifted Herbert and me from the desert, I felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. My mind was set. I had to go to Germany. I had to find Hannah and our daughter. I bid farewell to Herbert at the airport, grateful for the unexpected friendship forged in adversity. "Good luck, Faber," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Germany welcomed me with gray skies and a chill that seeped into my bones. I spent weeks searching, following every lead, knocking on doors and making countless phone calls. But Hannah seemed to have vanished without a trace. Each dead end felt like a punch to the gut, leaving me more dejected and confused than before. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting on a park bench, feeling utterly lost. The bedtime story I had imagined for myself, a happy reunion with Hannah and our daughter, was crumbling before my eyes. I was a scientist, used to solving complex problems, but this emotional puzzle left me baffled. Exhausted and heartsick, I decided to return to my original destination. Perhaps there, I thought, I might find some clue I had overlooked. As I boarded the train, little did I know that fate had a surprise in store for me. I was about to meet someone who would turn my world upside down once again. It happened in the dining car. I was absently stirring my coffee when a melodious laugh caught my attention. I looked up to see a young woman, her eyes sparkling with life, her smile brightening the entire room. She must have felt my gaze because she turned and our eyes met. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing to the chair across from me. "No, please," I said, suddenly feeling more alive than I had in weeks. "I'm Sabbath," she said, extending her hand. "Faber," I replied, taking her hand. The moment our fingers touched, I felt a jolt of electricity. We talked for hours, the train journey flying by. Sabbath was vibrant, intelligent, and curious about everything. She listened intently as I spoke about my work, asking questions that showed a keen scientific mind. In turn, she shared stories of her travels, her eyes lighting up as she described the wonders she'd seen. As we talked, I found myself laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight of my failed search lifted, if only for a moment. Sabbath had a way of making the world seem brighter, full of possibilities. When we reached our destination, I was surprised to learn that Sabbath was staying at the same hotel. "Must be fate," she said with a wink that made my heart skip a beat. Over the next few days, Sabbath and I were inseparable. We explored the city together, sharing meals, swapping stories, and staying up late into the night just talking. I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone in years. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a hilltop, Sabbath turned to me, her eyes serious. "Faber," she said softly, "I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I feel like I've known you all my life." I looked at her, this beautiful, vibrant young woman who had brought such unexpected joy into my life. Part of me felt guilty. Wasn't I supposed to be searching for my daughter? But another part of me felt more alive than I had in years. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a decision. I leaned in and kissed Sabbath, pouring all my confused emotions into that one gesture. When we broke apart, Sabbath's eyes were shining. "What do you say we go on an adventure?" she asked breathlessly. At that moment, I was ready to follow her anywhere. Little did I know, this whirlwind romance was about to lead me down a path I never could have imagined. The story of my life was far from over, and the most shocking twist was yet to come. The next morning, as Sabbath and I sat in a quaint cafe, sipping coffee and planning our day, an idea struck me like a bolt of lightning. "Sabbath," I said, my voice trembling with excitement, "what if we just left? What if we went on a road trip, just you and me? Her eyes lit up, a smile spreading across her face. To where? She asked, leaning forward. To the end of the earth, I replied, surprising myself with my spontaneity. Or as far as the road will take us. Sabbath's laughter filled the air, bright and carefree. Oh, Faber, she said, reaching for my hand, I thought you'd never ask. And just like that, we were off. We rented a car, packed our bags, and hit the open road. As the miles rolled by, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The search for Hannah and my daughter, the years of loneliness in Paris, even my rigid scientific worldview, all of it seemed to fade away with each passing kilometer. Our journey took us through picturesque villages, over winding mountain roads, and along stunning coastlines. We'd stop whenever the fancy struck us, to explore a hidden waterfall, to sample local delicacies in a roadside tavern, or simply to watch the sunset from a cliff overlooking the sea. At night, we'd find a cozy inn or sometimes just sleep under the stars, sharing stories as the campfire crackled. It was during these quiet moments that Sabbath began to open up about her past. My mother, she said one night, her voice soft in the darkness. She sacrificed everything for me. We didn't have much, but she always made sure I had books that I could pursue my dreams. As Sabbath spoke, I found myself drawn into her tales. The way she described her mother's determination, her kindness, her strength, it all seemed so familiar. She sounds like an amazing woman, I said, my throat tight with emotion. Sabbath nodded, her eyes glistening in the firelight. She is. I wish I knew more about my father. Mom never talked about him much. Something stirred in my chest, a mix of empathy and an emotion I couldn't quite name. I reached out and took Sabbath's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. As our journey continued, I began to notice things about Sabbath that I hadn't before. The way she'd furrow her brow when concentrating, just like Hannah used to. Her laugh, musical and warm, so similar to the one I'd fallen in love with years ago. Even some of her mannerisms, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear or bite her lip when she was nervous, all reminded me of Hannah. One afternoon, as we were driving along a coastal road, Sabbath was humming a tune. I nearly drove off the road when I recognized it. It was a lullaby Hannah used to sing. Where did you learn that song? I asked, my heart pounding. Sabbath looked surprised. Oh, it's just something my mom used to sing to me when I was little. Why, do you know it? I nodded, unable to speak. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I couldn't bring myself to voice the thought that was forming in my mind. It seemed impossible, and yet. That night, as we lay in a field gazing up at the stars, I found myself studying Sabbath's profile. The curve of her nose, the shape of her chin. How had I not seen it before? Faber? Sabbath's voice broke through my thoughts. Is everything okay? You've been quiet all evening. I turned to her, my heart full of a tumultuous mix of emotions. Love, fear, hope, and an overwhelming sense that I was on the brink of a life-changing discovery. Sabbath, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, there's something I need to tell you. Something about my past and why I came here in the first place. As I began my story, I had no idea how Sabbath would react. Would this be the end of our beautiful journey, or the beginning of something even more profound? The stars twinkled above us, silent witnesses to a story that was about to take its most unexpected turn yet. As I began to tell Sabbath my story, my voice trembled with emotion. I told her about Hannah, about the war that tore us apart, and about the letter that had brought me here. With each word, I saw Sabbath's expression change from curiosity to shock and then to something I couldn't quite read. Faber, she whispered, her eyes wide. What was your wife's full name? Hannah, I replied, my heart pounding. Hannah Schneider. Sabbath's face went pale. She sat up abruptly, her hands shaking. That's my mother's name. The world seemed to stop spinning. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The similarities, the shared memories, the inexplicable connection we'd felt from the start. Sabbath wasn't just any young woman. She was my daughter. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for air. I looked at Sabbath, really looked at her, and saw Hannah's eyes staring back at me, filled with a mix of confusion, hurt, and dawning comprehension. You're my father, she said, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. A whirlwind of emotions crashed over me. Joy at finally finding my daughter, shame for not recognizing her sooner, and a sickening guilt over the romantic feelings I'd developed. Sabbath stood up abruptly, backing away from me. I need some time, she said, before turning and running off into the darkness. I sat there, alone under the vast sky, my mind reeling. How could this happen? I was a man of science, of logic. I believed in facts and figures, in things that could be proven and measured. But this defied all reason. As the night wore on, I grappled with my thoughts. I questioned every decision I'd ever made. Should I have tried harder to return to Hannah during the war? Should I have come looking for them sooner? And how could I have fallen for my own daughter? The scientist in me tried to rationalize it. We hadn't known it was a natural attraction born from similar personalities and shared experiences. But the human in me, the part that had begun to awaken during this journey, was in turmoil. I thought about the nature of love and family. Were they just chemical reactions in the brain or something more? How could the same person evoke such different types of love, romantic and paternal, in such a short span of time? As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I heard footsteps approaching. Sabbath returned, her eyes red from crying, but with a determined set to her jaw. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down beside me. I nodded, my throat tight. "Sabbath, I'm so sorry. I never meant." She held up a hand, stopping me. "I know," she said softly. "Neither of us knew, but now we do, and we need to figure out what happens next." As we sat there, father and daughter reunited under the most unusual circumstances, I realized that my journey was far from over. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and complex emotions. But as I looked at Sabbath, my daughter, I felt a new kind of love blossoming in my heart. It was different from what I'd felt before, purer somehow. I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. This wasn't the happily ever after I'd imagined when I first set out on this journey. It was messier, more complicated. But as the sun rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that don't follow the expected path. Our bedtime story was far from over, and the next chapter promised to be the most challenging yet. But for the first time in years, I felt ready to face whatever came next, with my newfound daughter by my side. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sabbath and I sat in silence, the weight of our discovery hanging heavy between us. Finally, she spoke, her voice a mixture of anger and confusion. "All these years," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "I wondered about you, who you were, why you left. Mom never said much, but I could see the pain in her eyes whenever I asked." Her words cut deep into my heart. I reached out instinctively to comfort her, but stopped myself, unsure if my touch would be welcome. "I'm so sorry, Sabbath," I said, my voice cracking. "If I had known—" "But you didn't," she interrupted, a flash of anger in her eyes. "You weren't there. You missed everything. My first steps, my first day of school, every birthday." I listened, my heart breaking with each word. She was right, of course. I had missed so much, and no amount of explanations could make up for that lost time. As Sabbath continued to voice her feelings, I saw the little girl she must have been, lonely, confused, yearning for a father she never knew. But I also saw the strong, independent woman she had become, shaped by her experiences and her mother's love. Suddenly, Sabbath's anger seemed to deflate. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face. "But you're here now," she said softly. "You came looking for us." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "I'm angry," she continued, "and confused. But I'm also glad you're here. I've wanted to know you for so long." Her words were like a balm to my aching heart. Despite everything, there was still a chance for connection, for rebuilding what was lost. As we talked through the day, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of our lives, an idea began to form. "Sabbath," I said, as the sun began to set, "what if we went to find your mother, Hannah, together?" Her eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. "You'd do that?" I nodded. "I think it's time we all faced the past, don't you?" And so, our road trip took on a new purpose. We set off for Germany, following the trail of clues we had. Along the way, Sabbath shared more about her childhood, and I learned of the hardships Hannah had endured. She told me of the times they had to move in the middle of the night, of the odd jobs Hannah took to make ends meet, of the nights she heard her mother crying when she thought Sabbath was asleep. "She never stopped loving you, you know?" Sabbath said one evening as we pored over a map. She kept a photo of you hidden in her dresser. I found it once when I was little. Each revelation was like a knife to my heart, but also strengthened my resolve to make things right. Finally, after weeks of searching, we found Hannah in a small town on the outskirts of Munich. As we stood outside her modest house, my hand trembling as I raised it to knock, I felt Sabbath's hand slip into mine. "Together?" she asked, looking up at me with a mix of fear and hope. I squeezed her hand gently. "Together," I agreed. The door opened, and there she was, Hannah, older but still as beautiful as the day I left her. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in the sight of us. "Faber?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "Sabbath?" As we stood there on the threshold of a new chapter in our lives, I realized that this was more than just a bedtime story or a fantastic tale. This was real life, messy and complicated, filled with pain, but also with the possibility of healing and love. The three of us had a lot to talk about, a lot to work through. But as Hannah invited us in, her eyes shining with unshed tears, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, we could find a way to be a family after all these years. Our story was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like we might just find our happily ever after, not in spite of our past, but because of it. As we stepped into Hannah's home, the air was thick with tension and unspoken words. Hannah's eyes darted between Sabbath and me, a mix of emotions playing across her face: shock, joy, fear, and something that looked like hope. "You found each other," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sabbath nodded, squeezing my hand. "We did, Mom. It's been quite a journey." The three of us sat down in Hannah's small living room, the ticking of an old clock the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Then, like a dam bursting, we began to talk. Words flowed like a river. Explanations, apologies, accusations, and confessions. Hannah told us of her struggles, of the difficult choices she had to make. I shared my regrets and the loneliness that had been my constant companion. Sabbath spoke of her confusion and the void she had felt growing up without a father. There were tears, raised voices, and moments of painful silence. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The anger and hurt began to give way to understanding and forgiveness. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through the windows, I looked at Hannah and Sabbath, my family. Despite everything, we were together. "I know we can't erase the past," I said, my voice hoarse from talking all night, "but maybe we can build a future together." Hannah reached out, taking my hand in one of hers and Sabbath's in the other. "I'd like that," she said softly. Sabbath nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "Me too." In that moment, I felt a new kind of love blossoming, not the passionate love of youth, nor the exciting spark of a new romance, but a deep, abiding love for my family. Over the next few weeks, we embarked on a new journey together. We decided to revisit places that held meaning for each of us, healing old wounds and creating new memories. We went to the park where Hannah and I had our first date, now with Sabbath walking between us, her hands in ours. We visited the university where I had studied, Hannah and Sabbath laughing as I regaled them with stories of my absent-minded professor days. Each place held a piece of our past, but now we were writing a new story, together. One evening, as we stood on a bridge overlooking the river where Hannah and I had once made our vows, Sabbath turned to us with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know," she said, "I've always wanted to go on a family road trip." Hannah and I exchanged glances, then burst out laughing. "Haven't you had enough of the road?" I asked, thinking of the journey that had brought us here. Sabbath shook her head, smiling. "This time it's different. This time we're all together." And so, as the sun set on our old lives, we packed up Hannah's car and set off on a new adventure. As we drove towards the horizon, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. I, who had once believed only in what could be measured and proven, had been transformed by love and family. The world was no longer just a set of scientific principles to be understood, but a tapestry of emotions, connections, and possibilities. Looking at Hannah beside me, her hand resting gently on mine, and Sabbath in the back seat, her eyes bright with excitement for the future, I realized that this was the greatest discovery of my life. Our bedtime story didn't end with a happily ever after. Instead, it opened the door to a new chapter, filled with the promise of more stories to come. As we drove into the sunset, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, as a family. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the most beautiful equations in life are the ones that can't be solved, only lived.